Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Prize of Five podcast. Today I'm joined by Right Ruminations, and we are here to discuss the evolution of thought of the composer Richard Wagner. So, why don't you lay out the broad course of his thought?
This is a topic that struck my interest when I was reading Nietzsche's article Contra Wagner, which was meant to address certain issues that Nietzsche, the philosopher, saw with Wagner's politics, with his philosophy, with his religion, and its development. To lay the groundwork for this, it should be noted that Wagner was by far Nietzsche's favorite composer. And one of the reasons is that in Wagner, you see these pagan, primordial, very pan-European type themes that speak to this Nietzschean idea of the Übermensch. Later on, however, it's arguable that themes develop in Wagner that are decidedly more pacific, more Christian, more favorable towards ideas like chastity. And this is also accompanies developments that take place in Nietzsche's political affiliations, such as supporting German unification, the German nation state, his growing affiliation with certain Protestant German princes who were liberals. Overall, I would say that Wagner, at least the way Nietzsche sees Wagner's development, is that he goes from being the kind of romantic that Nietzsche is looking for to being the kind of German Christian liberal that Nietzsche definitely did not think very highly of. It's important to note that delineations of left and right at that time were very different from what they are now. So, for example, support for the state or support for nationalism were things that were seen to be part of the left, really working from the premises of the French Revolution. Nietzsche was not a conservative by any stretch of the imagination, but he was a right-winger of sorts in that he rejected these ideas of democracy, of democratic socialism, of Christian charity, and things of this nature. Whether this is actually a switch in Wagner or whether it's more on the perception of Nietzsche in light of certain developments that took place in Germany at that time in relation to Wagner is another question. What I would say is that Wagner is overall seems to be a kind of compositional embodiment of Romanticism. His politics seem to be an embodiment of Romanticism. On the one hand, he's anti-monarchy and pro-liberalism, so this idea of political radicalism. On the other hand, he supports the sort of mystique of Germany in terms of supporting unification, of having these themes of knighthood and of Christianity in his operas. It all does become very complicated because the interplay between Protestant and Catholic themes, of nationalistic versus anti-authoritarian themes, can all become very muddled. So to put it in perspective, I would say that in Wagner, you have all of these contradictions of Romanticism and of the 19th century left. And Wagner was indeed highly involved in leftist nationalistic politics at the time. I think that Nietzsche's dislike and liking of Wagner is kind of, I think, maybe beneath the surface of it, indicative of the fact that Nietzsche was not entirely content with these distinctions or these tensions, these inner contradictions in Romanticism, whereas Wagner was more of a blanket romantic, to my thinking, which really means that Wagner's politics don't really have a clear parallel in modern politics. For example, most people today who are nationalists are on the right. Most people who are hardline nationalist romantics are not anti-monarchical in the way that Wagner was. So it is rather specific to its age, but I do think that these different elements in Wagner are things that show their contradictory nature due to the fact that Nietzsche could simultaneously be a fan of Wagner, but also become very disheartened by Wagner, precisely because I think that Nietzsche was much more selective in terms of the aspects of Romanticism to which he gave his approval. Those are some surface thoughts on the matter.
Yeah. So now you had said that Wagner began as a sort of more like a European universalist and then became more specifically a German nationalist. So what exactly does a European universalist look like? Because today, in light of modern politics, that could either mean the European Union, it could mean some sort of Richard Spencer Roman Empire, or it could mean some sort of esoteric Evolian state. None of which probably would describe what Wagner meant by that. But what would that have looked like, or what did he envision that looking like?
Well, I probably overstated the case of this in my video. What I would say is that it's very clear that Nietzsche's view of pan-Europeanism was very Spencerian in the idea that it was kind of trans-ethnic, pre or perhaps post-national, but definitely in keeping with this idea of a sort of primordial European man who was both of the past and of the future, and who was decidedly European racially speaking, but not German or French or Italian ethnically speaking. This is one of the reasons that Nietzsche could like the Roman Empire, let's say, or the ancient Greeks, even though he was a German, because he had this more universal idea, which was probably fairly anachronistic in some measure, of a sort of Occidental identity. In Wagner, I'm not sure that this is necessarily ever explicitly the case, because there is always this, and perhaps earlier on, maybe Nietzsche misread Wagner to an extent, but there is in Wagner this tension between the idea of imperial Roman power versus European Nordic identity, such as you see in the opera Tannhäuser, in which the idea is that the Pope has all of these unrealistic puritanical expectations about what is necessary for forgiveness, and he's not willing to forgive Tannhäuser. Whereas the idea is that in his sort of European identity, he can find redemption. So Wagner is always more explicitly Anglo-Saxon than Nietzsche, but there is this sense in which his earlier operas are more in condemnation of bourgeois society. Like in Rienzi, for example, there is an explicit advocacy for a certain degree of degeneracy or hedonism. And in fact, the whole plot of that is that the puritanical governor is taken to task for his hypocrisy, and everyone is able to sort of celebrate their licentious freedom against this papal or allegedly Latin imposition of morality on the free European people. I think it's this kind of thing that Nietzsche liked in Wagner, where there is this licentiousness, where there is this idea of a Dionysian spirit, as it were. Whereas by the time you get to Parsifal, at the end of Wagner's career, you see him supporting the German nation state and unification. You see him supporting liberalism. You see him supporting Pacific themes in his opera. And what Nietzsche sees in this is a movement away from the free spirit toward a kind of conformist, vaguely anti-Semitic, Christian kind of normieism. And so in part it's reality, and in part it's Nietzsche's perception. I think that a large part of what informs Nietzsche's perception is that it's near the end of the 19th century that unification takes place, and so it brings out certain tendencies in Wagner. But I do think that also, on the other hand, Nietzsche has a point in that if you follow Wagner's operas, they go from being anti-puritanical, anti-moralistic, to becoming much more earnest, much more serious, and much more pietistic by the time you get to the end of Wagner's career with Parsifal.
It sounds like what you're describing is Nietzsche liked, given the Greek concept of the four loves, eros, philia, storge, and agape, the younger Wagner was representative of eros, which is love that's passionate, that's intense in its desire. Doesn't always have to be, but often is associated with sexual desire. And then by the time you get to Parsifal, you get something more like agape love, which is, again, from the Bible, the love that God has for us. And I can see why Nietzsche, with his Dionysian and more sort of pre-Socratic tendencies, would value that. But I think that would not be an incorrect way of describing it.
I would agree with that. And I also think it's important to note something about the terms at the time. So one of the things that Nietzsche condemned, rather, is socialism. But you have to take into account that socialism in Germany at the time was not necessarily used to refer to the kind of dirty revolutionary on the street. If you look at what socialism meant in the popular vocabulary at the time, the term had been co-opted by the respectable socialists of the chair, associated with Bismarck, and this was meant to distinguish them from the revolutionary Marxist socialist, and to say that these are the respectable nationalist German Protestant welfare state supporting socialists, that these are the respectable national socialists who are not subject of ridicule, but are part of liberalism, more so than any kind of freewheeling radicalism. And so it becomes clear why Nietzsche didn't like that particular kind of socialism, because he saw it as a part of the overly protected, non-dangerous aspect of German life, of bourgeois German life. Everything that Nietzsche detested is kind of embodied in this idea of the German state that has easy access to a financial support or some kind of social security net, and that keeps people safe, and it keeps them in the context of this kind of proverbially socks and sandals wearing Protestantism that doesn't speak to the sort of life of danger or of risk or of primordial greatness that Nietzsche perhaps unrealistically fetishized. And in Wagner, I think that the concepts more bleed together. It's not that Wagner ever rejected the earlier concept, but it's that for Wagner, these tensions in Romanticism don't provide a difficulty. So if there's always this kind of leftist and rightist element in Romanticism, Nietzsche was more willing to kind of maintain the facade of coherency in that, well, yes, he supported democracy. He supported liberalism. He supported nationalism. He supported certain aspects of Christianity and not other aspects of Christianity. He maybe supported certain pacific themes and certain violent themes. He was a kind of generic bohemian, but he was also, above being a fan of Nietzsche, he was a fan of the philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer, who had a lot of the same framework of Nietzsche in terms of this idea of a universal will, that there is this will to power, but unlike Nietzsche, Schopenhauer takes the position that it's something to be rejected. So there is a certain degree of what Nietzsche would think of as sentimentality. And so for Wagner, it's not necessarily, it's a development, but it's not necessarily a contradiction that he would have recognized, because the idea that there could be voice given to these romantic themes in terms of a safe nationalism or safe social nationalism is not really a contradiction. It's a kind of institutionalization or an expression. The way I might put the difference is that Wagner had a bit, or perhaps a lot, of the college campus bohemian in him. That is, he did not necessarily show himself to be cognizant of the tension between the fact that on the one hand he wanted to be this nonconformist, cutting edge, revolutionary type, but on the other hand it was kind of popular to be that, and it was sort of part of a movement. Whereas I think that Nietzsche was more of a genuinely disagreeable radical. And so I think that insofar as these romantic ideas came to be given a kind of popular or movement-oriented expression, Nietzsche found it totally distasteful. Whereas Wagner, I think, probably would have been simplistic enough to see it as just a natural expression of romanticism. And something that can cement this is that in his writings, Nietzsche says very harsh things about the Jews and Judaism, and blames them for kind of using Christianity and the genealogy of morals to undermine European man with a certain sentimental meta framework. But then by the time you get to Wagner's later years, Nietzsche is condemning anti-Semitism in his essay on Contra Wagner, because anti-Semitism has at this time become more popular, and it's become part of this German liberal nationalistic movement. And so Nietzsche is, I think, he sort of turns on anti-Semitism when it becomes part of a simplistic or sentimental national liberal movement, but Wagner simply becomes a part of that movement.
Mm-hmm. One possible way to, if it is at all possible, to reconcile the beliefs of the early and later Wagner, is that in Platonic philosophy, eros is associated with a strong desire for the forms. The idea that we love what is physical because it points us to the higher perfection of the forms. So one could argue that it's more Christian, more classically Christian-esque elements like Parsifal would be this sort of Platonic elevation of eros to a higher plane.
Well, it is true that there's more than one Platonic element in what Wagner has to say. That is, he did not have a merely conceptual understanding of his works. That is, he did believe that his works were oriented towards a deep sense of contemplation that was an end in itself. That is, they weren't just meant to be a message for a Christian or a pagan or a German message. They did speak to some kind of immediate contemplative apprehension of the world of forms. That is, they were meant to celebrate some kind of ineffable ideal. And so, in light of that, it's easy to see how these ideas could blend together, or could be read as being able to plausibly bleed together, in that if what on the one hand you're advocating is freedom from authority or from triteness, but on the other hand you're also arguing for purity, then you could kind of meld those together, and it almost seems like the kind of charmingly naive or primordially simplistic sort of thinking that you might have somebody like George Lucas today engaging in, where it is just this idea of the good guy, right? Well, the good guy likes freedom. He also likes purity. He likes, on the one hand, to enjoy life, and he wants to see people enjoy life. But on the other hand, he also understands the nobility of sacrifice. So I do think that there is this kind of idea, or this apprehension of the liberal soul, of the person who is above the bad attitudes or the triteness or the dirtiness of society, and who has a certain, maybe not political freedom, but a freedom of spirit that is innocent. And I really think that might be a good distinction that you've come on to there, that maybe with Wagner, because there's this Platonic sensibility, that although they both have this romantic sense of greatness, the one thing that maybe links these seemingly contradictory elements in Wagner is that they are all speaking or pointing towards a greatness that maintains innocence. And Nietzsche hated innocence. And I think that as innocence became more sort of explicit as a theme in Wagner, tying together all of these elements, innocent in terms of wanting to be left alone, to be somewhat degenerate, innocent in terms of adhering to an innocent ideal of chastity, innocent in terms of wanting to be generous, innocent in terms of not liking contract law, innocent in terms of liking democracy, innocent in whatever way that that could be applied to some romantic ideal. As this becomes more explicit, obviously Nietzsche becomes very unhappy because you might summarize the thrust of Nietzsche's whole spirit as being an opposition to innocence.
Mm-hmm. I also find it interesting that Nietzsche views, in his own time, the Catholics as being too puritanical. Normally, now maybe that's because in North America, it's very different. The Catholics are not perceived as being puritanical, and certainly not in South America. So it's interesting that he would have that association, whereas in the rest of the world, I mean, I guess if you grew up in Italy or Brazil and you didn't know any other country and you wanted to be degenerate, okay, yeah, I guess you would see them as overly puritanical. But again, compared to what? I think a lot of people tend to view Protestants as more puritanical on paper than the Catholics.
Well, I think that going back to Luther in the German psyche, you have this kind of image of the Italians as these sort of hypocritical Puritans. So they don't live up to it, but they want to enforce it on other people. So it's a kind of mythology, and partly supported by fact and partly exaggerated. That you have this idea of, well, on the one hand, they want to force everyone else to live up to these moralistic standards. But on the other hand, they're selling indulgences and they're kind of forcing this hypocritical double standard on the otherwise free German people. And I do believe that there is probably a subconscious Lutheran influence there. And after all, I believe that Nietzsche's father was a German pastor. I may be incorrect about that, but that's my recollection. And well, something, for example, that, and it gets interesting here, that Nietzsche would have liked about Tannhäuser is that you do have this theme of the idea that Christianity has been corrupted by the Latins, that it has been corrupted by Catholicism, in that the Pope is not willing to grant redemption. He's not willing to grant freedom until flowers once again grow on his staff, which is to say, never. But then by understanding himself as a good, free Northern European, the protagonist is able to find redemption from this harsh standard of the Pope. Likewise, in Rienzi, you see this idea that that really even this puritanical magistrate is really himself sleeping around and he's not living up to his own standards. So I think that really a part of the accusation of Puritanism on the part of the Catholics is also, it fits hand in glove with the accusations of licentiousness and paganism, in that it's trying to say, this is what they preach, this is how they act. And I think that this is something that pleased Nietzsche when Wagner pointed it out. But even at this early date, you see the seeds of disagreement, because what Nietzsche is seeing in that opera is not necessarily what Wagner is saying. What Wagner is saying is that these conservative Latin Italians have an unrealistic standard for us free Germans, and our more innocent Protestant understanding or patristic understanding of Christianity doesn't have this same impossible loops that one has to jump through. And so it's a more honest expression of Christianity. What I think Nietzsche sees is it's the idea of Europe free from Christian hegemony. Nietzsche had no problem with the the non-Aryan Italians and with the Roman Imperium as it expressed itself in terms of pre-Christianity. In fact, I think he much preferred that to German nationalism. So in this rebellion of the Nordic spirit from the Latin Christian hegemony, what they prima facie, Nietzsche and Wagner can agree with this, but the thing is that Wagner then wants to take that in the direction of German nationalism. Nietzsche wants to take it in the direction of pre-Christianity. So on the surface, they seem to be in agreement, but they're implicitly oriented in opposite directions, if you see what I mean.
Mm-hmm. One thing that's also interesting is that both of these thinkers, and many still today, would argue that the sort of what we would call euphemistically puritanical norms were Christian and that they were imposed on the Germanic peoples. You see this a lot with the alt-right, not just with the Odinists or Thules, but in general, the broader alt-right. But what I find interesting about this is that they don't know very much about the ancient Germans. Tacitus in his Germania writes, they have no tract of mercy on a wife who prostitutes her chastity. Neither beauty, youth, nor wealth can find her another husband. No one in Germany finds vice amusing or calls it up to date to seduce and be seduced. Even better is the practice of those statutes in which only virgins may marry, so that a woman who has once been a bride has finished with all such hopes and aspirations. She has taken one husband just as she has taken one body and one life. That's pre-Christian Germany, and that actually sounds very similar to a lot of developments that we would find with the Christian religion. So it isn't even good history.
Well, this is a very interesting transition into what I think is a very important point, which is that I think that if you look at the character of Germans in general, for better or for worse, they do have a predilection toward a certain degree of conformity. You see this in terms of modern Germany with its radical anti-fascism. You find it in National Socialism itself. You find it in the kind of respectable culture that Nietzsche and Wagner were themselves railing against. I think that maybe a lot of what is called Puritan in Germany that is then attributed to Rome may actually be more proximate in a certain element within Germany itself. After all, if you look at the names of the people that Martin Luther was complaining about, well, these were not Italian names, they weren't Spanish names. The people who were selling the indulgences in his area, the people with whom he was immediately contending, were his fellow Germans. So there is this sense in which much of what is perhaps misplaced in being attributed to Rome or the Latins is itself an expression of the Germanification of Christianity. So much of the puritanical attributions to Christianity are not fundamentally Roman, and perhaps they're not even fundamentally Protestant, but in a sense they might be at their base very ethnically German. And the broader point that I'd like to relate this to is that Wagner rather, in protesting that particular paradigm of the puritanical German form of Christianity, basically ended up involved in the German nationalist movement, which turned out to be just as conformist, just as German, just as respectable as the earlier forms of conservative monarchical thinking that it was supposedly revolting against. In other words, I think that Nietzsche's great disappointment in Wagner might have been to discover that once Wagner's views came into vogue, that Wagner was actually German. I think that really is the best way of summarizing Nietzsche's disaffection with Wagner, is that Nietzsche was not happy about being German precisely because he saw this kind of spirit that you are tracing back to the ancient pre-Christian Germans. I think that basically Wagner saw in, or Nietzsche saw in Wagner, the opportunity for a rebellion in Germany against this collectivist German spirit. But once it actually became popular and successful, Nietzsche saw that it basically was just as German as what it was replacing. And I think his ultimate disaffection with Wagner was learning just how German he turned out to be.
So maybe Nietzsche was, a self-hating German, and in which case it's rather than odd for the alt-right to embrace Nietzsche while simultaneously trying to embrace, a National Socialist ethos in many cases, which it's doubtful Nietzsche would have approved of.
Well, I would say that it's more contradictory on the part of the National Socialists themselves for wanting to appropriate Nietzsche. I think that I've often joked that if Nietzsche were alive at the time of the Nazis, he wouldn't have been one. But if he were alive today, he would be a Nazi, probably on the internet. But I think that what is not so contradictory, if you look at Richard Spencer, say, and his very enthusiastic outlook on Nietzsche, is that Richard Spencer actually does reject German nationalism or any kind of nationalism, which is something that gets him in trouble with the dissident right, because Richard Spencer really is consistent in wanting a kind of pan-European empire that includes Russians and Italians and German, and that really is trans-ethnic and kind of pan-racial in a sense, or pan-European, but racial in a way that's trans-ethnic. I think that this is a much more honest expression of what Nietzsche supported than how the Nazis appropriated him. To his credit, Richard Spencer is documented as basically pointing out this inconsistency in the Nazis and saying that they did support a kind of outgrowth of liberal nationalism that is not quite as consistently or well developed as this sort of pan European theme that you see in Nietzsche. Likewise, to give credit to where credit's due, I think that Greg Johnson also knows this, and this is why Greg Johnson doesn't like Nietzsche, because he sees Nietzsche as a kind of anti-nationalist in this sense, whereas, of course, Johnson is very consistently ethno-nationalist. So I'd say the reason Spencer likes Nietzsche is because he is a kind of trans-nationalist, whereas the reason that Johnson doesn't like him is because Johnson is a consistent nationalist, whatever one thinks of that. But the Nazis certainly were being inconsistent in their appropriation of Nietzsche, because I think he was a very uncooperative person, to say the least. And I certainly don't think he would have been all that fond of them.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And now Parsifal, that's from Percival from the Arthurian saga, and I think he is one of the three who saw the Holy Grail, right? It was Galahad, Percival, and Sir Bors, right? Those are the three that saw the Holy Grail, and Galahad was assumed into paradise. So I think that's the whole tenor of that play, right? The Grail quest, right?
Yes, that's correct. And this is not an archetypal Evolan interpretation of the Holy Grail. I think that this is quite clearly supposed to be the real thing. It's not a kind of pagan archetype. This is the Holy Grail as it is articulated in actual Christian mythology, or at least that's my understanding of it. So Nietzsche certainly was not misreading Wagner in terms of being disillusioned with it, if his expectation of Wagner was that he'd be in keeping with his own philosophy. I do have to wonder if there is something of a spirit of conversion in Parsifal if you compare it to the openly hedonistic and kind of juvenile themes in some of Wagner's earlier operas, but that would be just as much speculation on my part as it is on Nietzsche's part. Nietzsche speculated that there was some kind of seasonal conversion of Wagner to Christianity at that time, for which there isn't really any evidence that he underwent any kind of formal conversion toward or away Christianity or anything else. So all of those themes are somewhat beneath the surface, as it were, but there is definitely something that Wagner is getting at, because it's not only in the theme. It's also in the quality of the music itself. It sounds different from his other operas. If you listen to Parsifal, it's much more conservative sounding than, say, The Flying Dutchman.
Yes, and I'm looking at a sort of outline of Nietzsche's critique of Wagner. He accuses Wagner of being effete in a Parisian. What's interesting is this sort of unbridled eros that Nietzsche advocates for, and this sort of lack of restraint, his ideal of Dionysian orgy. It's funny, right? Nietzsche's perceived to be a masculine philosopher, but really a complete lack of restraint throughout the Western intellectual tradition has always been associated with women or womanish men. The whole point of self-mastery, whether it was the military prowess of Achilles or the intellectual self-control of a Plotinus, it was mastering one's passions, one's desires, that made one a man. And it seems odd that Nietzsche has been associated, and even tried to make the association that he was a masculine figure, more primal, more life-affirming, when in reality, he's the one that has all the characteristic traits of effeteness.
Well, I think that you do have to keep in mind that Nietzsche's outlook was very pre-Socratic, as you say, and I did refer to Socrates as the malicious Socrates, and complained about all of these thinkers for whom you might claim as attesting to your definitions of masculinity and effeminacy. He condemns them all for not being married, and if you do look back at the pre-Socratic gods, they, I do think, possibly had something that could at least be interpreted as a kind of macho persona that is associated with a certain promiscuousness. I think that it's more of this earlier paradigm that Nietzsche is rightly or wrongly trying to get back to, which he sees as being upset by the Platonic Christian Judeo tradition. So once again, I don't know if it's necessarily a contradiction on Nietzsche's part, though I will say that it's rather amusing that he saw Wagner as being Parisian and effete for a number of reasons. One is that Wagner was certainly a much more archetypally masculine figure than Nietzsche, because Nietzsche was a kind of incel of his day, was kind of an armchair philosopher type, whereas Wagner was a very successful, worldly, cutting-edge artist who was very closely associated with a number of successful political figures, and he was married twice, I believe, and he definitely knew the world much more so than Nietzsche himself did. So there's some irony in that. There's another irony in the fact that Nietzsche supposedly is in rejection of this kind of Germanocentric, anti-Parisian or anti-Jewish spirit or what have you, that he's supposed to be have the pan-European perspective, but he's clearly willing to kind of advocate for a certain Germanicism contra Wagner. The third thing that makes it highly ironic is that Nietzsche absolutely despised the Parisians. A number of times he was forced into exile because of his support for leftist national politics and anti-monarchical politics in Dresden. and because of his participation in the revolution in Dresden, he is expelled from Germany and forced to live in Paris, and he hates it because he can't stand the French. He thinks that the French are inferior to the Germans. In other words, he hates the Germans, or he hates the French, pardon me, much more than Nietzsche did, precisely because Nietzsche was not, and he did not have the same kind of Germanocentric ethnic sensibility. I really do find this accusation of Wagner, of Nietzsche towards Wagner, to be highly ironic, considering all of these contradictions, not least of which is the fact that Nietzsche was so much more worldly and actually was doing things like participating in active revolutions than Nietzsche was.
Yes. Now, what kind of German nationalism was Wagner getting involved in? So, for example, from the period from after the end of the Napoleonic Wars till the ascension of Bismarck as prime minister, there was a sort of liberal German nationalism which was associated with the Revolution of 48. But with the rise of Bismarck, you have a more Prussian German nationalism with blood and iron, more conservative, more circumspect, more martial rather than populist and democratic. So which one of those two was Wagner?
Well, maybe this is what Nietzsche was becoming frustrated with, is that I think he was both. I think in spirit, he was definitely more the liberal nationalist, because if you look at what got him kicked out of Dresden, it was this idea of abolish all monarchs, embrace Protestantism, embrace the nation, embrace liberalism and democracy, and the idea of the free German people as opposed to the overbearing Latin, Judeo-Slavic peoples, have basically a Whig outlook of history. The idea is that we had the Great Reformation with Martin Luther, that we had the free Germanic tribes, that now now we'll be able to do away with the monarchy, and we'll be able to have a sort of independent German people whose nationalism is expressed through democracy and potentially even socialism. Now, not only would that ideal irk Nietzsche, but the fact that Wagner could be interpreted as being so superficial, in that by the time you get to unification, Wagner is certainly supporting unification and even writing music for unification. In fact, he has an overture called the Kaiser March, or pardon me, not the Kaiser March. There is I believe it's called. Pardon me, I do forget the name. The Kaiser March is a different Prussian march. He has an overture which is dedicated to the Kaiser, and to unification, and so there is this kind of irony and perhaps simplistic thinking that somehow in this monarchical imperial unification that you could have an expression of these earlier liberal ideals probably would have irritated a critical intellectual like Nietzsche. But the fact that what Wagner, where his heart ultimately was with this liberal nationalism, would have further aggravated Nietzsche's sensibilities. I think that the overall picture is that maybe Wagner was a liberal nationalist, but maybe one who had a healthy dose of superficiality in his willingness to support certain expressions of monarchy when it was sensational enough or when the mood hit him. I can't imagine anything that would irritate Nietzsche more than that.
Yeah. And when you look at how I guess it's only natural we end with this, is how the alt-right, or the right in general, has this schizophrenia with these two figures, and that it wants to at times affirm both. But it becomes increasingly difficult to affirm both once you realize how far they deviated from where they started.
I would agree with that, and I think that that once again gets us back to the fact that if you're going to be a thoroughgoing Nietzschean, you can only like Wagner's worldview so much when you realize that he was such a fan of Arthur Schopenhauer. And those certainly are not compatible philosophies, at least not in terms of their ultimate conclusions. They may be similar in their diagnosis, but not in terms of where they ultimately take things in light of this view of a kind of will to power. I think that, like with the dissident right supporting any number of contradictory things, whether it be Catholicism and paganism and, say, Wagner and nationalism and the idea of pan European racialism and all of these different elements, I do think that there is a kind of spirit of looking backward and seeing all of these things as being much more closely affiliated than they actually might be. I would like to be fair in saying that obviously the dissident right is not a single person. It's not an amorphous blob. It does have different people who support different things. I would think that if you were to confront, say, Richard Spencer about it, he would probably admit that he comes down against Nietzsche's politics, even though I have heard that he likes his, or against Wagner's politics, even though I've heard he likes his music, and definitely would side with Nietzsche. Likewise, you'd have people who are more of the kind of ethno-nationalist, traditionalist variety, who definitely are more Wagnerian than with respect to politics than Nietzschean. I think that really, insofar as someone could uphold both Wagner and Nietzsche, what they would have to do is they would have to frame it in terms of wanting to read Wagner through the lens of Nietzsche. That is to see in Wagner what Nietzsche saw in Wagner in the first place, and perhaps even share in the disappointments. What I would say is that a large part of the dissident right is politically much closer to Wagner, maybe minus the distaste for monarchy, but the ethno-nationalist part of the dissident right, I would think, is probably actually quite close to a kind of late 19th century German ethno-nationalist perspective that at the time would have been considered liberal and perhaps even socialistic. Whereas it's more the hardline Spencerians who come closer to this sort of anti-nationalist pan-Europeanism that you see in Genealogy of Morals. I don't think that one could embrace both in a thoroughgoing way without embracing some kind of contradiction. But I do think it's easier to be a Nietzschean who likes Wagner than it is to be a Wagnerian who likes Nietzsche, because I think that Nietzsche's outlook would totally be against, say, the kind of more textbook ethno-nationalism of, say, Greg Johnson or Ramsey Paul or Millennial Woes, and probably would have much more kinship with the Spencerians.
Yeah. Well, I think we've covered most of this topic. Is there anything you'd like to leave us with before we wrap it up?
Just by cementing the fact that I think that in his politics, Wagner was the generic romantic. When romanticism calls for one to be nationalistic, he was nationalistic. When it called for some support of monarchy, he supported monarchy. When romanticism called for the overthrow of monarchy in the name of popular democracy, he supported democracy. When romanticism agreed with Nietzsche, Wagner agreed with Nietzsche. When romanticism didn't agree with Nietzsche, Wagner didn't agree with Nietzsche. I think that his music, his politics, his nationalism, his liberalism, and even his kind of naive view of Christianity are all sort of emblematic of the person who somehow was able to put his finger so well on the pulse of romanticism that in his music and politics he was able to be a kind of embodiment of a generic romanticism, whatever one makes of that, despite all of the potential contradictions. if only for that reason, one has to admire him for being so attuned to this phenomenon and for his commitment to a certain kind of consistency.
Yes, well, thank you, Right Ruminations. This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.